how are upstream emissions, including flaring, dealt with in producing blue hydrogen? And is that taken into account when comparing costs with green?
Yes, they are. So thanks for the question. I think it's a pertinent point. It also reflects one of the points made by Francois. Just want to comment initially that I think that we all agree that we would like to transform to a complete renewable society, and also that we would like to get there as fast as we can. But then, as also was pointed out, I think we need sort of common metrics for how to sort of have a level playing field. And in that sense, you need to have, for instance, a life cycle assessment based approach to be able to actually judge what kind of greenhouse gas footprint you have for your hydrogen. And this is also what is being introduced both in policy today, for instance, through the EU taxonomy and through also other mechanisms in other places of the world, where you're talking about low carbon hydrogen and you're also talking about ultra low carbon hydrogen. And it's true, if you have a sort of a pure green electricity mix, you might get down at a very low level. Below, let's say, 1 kilo of CO2 equivalents per kilo of hydrogen produced. Whereas if you have blue hydrogen, you might also reach that level, but that's more challenging. And it's also true that you need to include both the upstream emissions that comes from the oil and gas production itself, including whatever flaring is happening if you're doing that. You need to include emissions that occur from the transport and distribution of gas. You need to include the any emissions that you have from the gas reforming itself. And you need to also include the capture rates. And I think this is something that DNV has looked into quite extensively. So it depends very much on the source of gas. And in order to reach, let's say, a low carbon hydrogen target, you need to have, let's say, a gas supply that doesn't have very high emissions of methane, for instance. But sort of in the general speaking, if you have an average type of gas supply, you can still sort of have a blue hydrogen that meets a low carbon standard with a capture rate that is achievable today with current technology. It's not demonstrated in plants that are in operation today, but those plants were not optimized with regards to having a high capture rate. Some of those are developed for different purposes. So that's possible. And if you, for instance, take an example of what you have in Norway, where in Norway you have methane emissions, which is extremely low. So that they're sort of at the 100th level of what you have as a sort of a global average. And in that case, you can also meet the ultra low emission targets also with the blue hydrogen and with a high capture rate. So it's possible. Higher capture rates, it does affect the cost. So of course that is an increasing component. But I think that in new technology, it was mentioned that you have 50-60% capture rates. That is typically something that applies to steam methane reforming. When it comes to sort of novel technologies and the plants that are being built today, you typically go for an autothermal reforming, which is a process that is easier to capture, and it's generally sort of easier to make that. So I think you'll see developments in that area as well. But I guess the main point I want to make is that in comparing costs, you include the cost of the full CCS system, you include the cost of sort of managing your emissions, and still what we're seeing is that it will be competitive with gray hydrogen within the next 5 years or so. That's what we're seeing.